Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the July talk for Society of Army Historical Research. The PMC has given me permission to take the jacket off and not wear a tie this evening. It's still quite warm up here in Newark. We've had 86 people register for this evening, and I can already see that there are 25 people in the room. I know from looking at the attendance, the register, that there are a number of people here this evening who have been to the talks before, but I've also noticed that there's one or two new names. So forgive me those old hands if I just go through some of the bibs and bobs about the Demio platform and how we're going to approach the evening. So the Demio platform works through your internet connection, and therefore, if you are experiencing any audio or visual problems this evening, and it happens occasionally, there are a few quick immediate action drills that you can apply. The first is to refresh your page, and it's very easy for someone to say refresh your page, and quite a lot of us don't know how to do it. But if you look to the top left of your browser, you should see an incomplete circle with an arrow. If you click on that button, that refreshes your page, and that will often sort out any problems that you might have. If your problems with the audio or visual feed continue, then you can always log off and log back on again using the same link that you joined this evening. And if that second IA drill doesn't work, then the third IA drill, which may be open to some of you, if you have another browser, so perhaps you're looking at this through Chrome, but you can access Safari, then sometimes working through another browser helps. If you really want to work out how good your internet connection is this evening, you can look in the top right corner of your screen and you'll see the familiar settings cogwheel. If you click on that cogwheel, it will bring a drop-down menu, and in the bottom right-hand corner of that, there's a run test in green. Click on that and that will tell you how good your internet connection is this evening. But hopefully none of you will have problems this evening, and everything will run smoothly. We communicate via the chat box so that we don't have any problems with having to disable people's microphone or cameras. So if you wish to pose a question this evening to our speaker, then please write it in the chat box, and I will identify it and bring it up at the end. Now, to save time, what we ask is that you bring those questions to the attention as they occur to you. If Mark later in this talk covers the point that you raised in your question, then clearly I won't put it to him. But it saves the problems at the end of everyone trying to type at the same time. So I will put reminders in about the immediate action drills, and I will put reminders in about posing your questions as we go along in the chat box myself. So that's enough, I think, by way of introduction. We've been going for about 3.5 minutes or so. The only other thing I need to remind people, because someone will ask me during the evening, is this session being recorded? And yes, it is. And copies of the recording will go out to everyone who registered for the event, regardless of their attendance here this evening. And so if you've registered for the event and you're watching this by the recording, there are just two other things that I need to bring to your attention. The first is that you unfortunately will not be able to see the chat box in the recording. And secondly, you will not be able to see the questions that I'll pose to the speaker when I put them up on screen. So for that reason, it's my normal practice that when I put a question up which can be seen by the audience in the live session, I will read it out. So it may be, I will say, Eamon this evening has asked the following question, and then I'll read the question out. Forgive me if you're in the live audience, if you can read for yourself, but I'm reading out the question, but that's why I do it. Okay, I think that's enough by way of introduction. So what I'm going to ask is our speaker this evening, Dr. Mark Thompson, to come up onto the stage and give us his presentation. on something that I particularly have been looking forward to ever since it was raised that we were going to have this talk. It's the logistics of a siege in the Peninsular War. Dr. Mark Thompson has been a regular contributor to many webinars and forums. He's also a highly published author, and he will give us some indication of his authorship at the end of this talk. But I think by way of introduction, that's all I want to say, Mark. I'm going to take myself off the stage. I'm going to put your slides up, and then I will come back at the end to run the question and answer session. So let me just make certain that the slides are up. Okay, Mark, over to you.
Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Dudley. I would like to thank the Society of Army Historical Research for inviting me to speak to you tonight. Now, during the Peninsular War, the Duke of Wellington had to carry out a number of sieges. His first successful siege was at Ciudad Rodrigo in January 1812. This paper will give an insight into the planning and logistical challenges involved in carrying out a siege, using Ciudad Rodrigo as an example. But bear in mind, many of the things I say will apply to any nation undertaking a siege at this time. Also bear in mind that this particular siege is seen as the best organized and executed siege by the Allies during the war. But there were issues. And just my final point before I start going is, I will not be talking about the siege itself tonight, just the events leading up to it. But I will point you at a particular book if you want to know more about the siege. And clearly I'm biased in the one I will point you at. Okay, Ciudad Rodrigo today. One of the nice things about visiting the Iberian Peninsula is that many towns and battlefields still show the way they were 200 years ago, and Ciudad Rodrigo is no exception. You can see the walls, you can see the site of the breach, and you can walk around them all, which makes it all the more fascinating. And Ciudad Rodrigo, of course, apart from being well known for the siege, is also well known for its world famous Museum of the Chamber Pot, the Museo de Orinal. If you want to find it, it's just by the main entrance to the cathedral. Okay, bit of background. The Peninsular War. It's often seen as a bit of a sideshow for the main Napoleonic War operations that were going on in Central Europe, but it played its own part in the eventual demise of Napoleon. France, with support of the Spanish, invaded Portugal in 1807 to enforce the continental blockade, which is the French and their subsidiaries trying to stop all trade with the United Kingdom. Having achieved this in 1808, Napoleon saw an opportunity to also take control of Spain and deposed the Spanish monarchs, replacing them with his brother Joseph. And this led to deep insurrection in Spain. And of course, Portugal were unhappy about what had happened to them. So both of these countries were asked to provide financial and military aid to support their cause. Okay, I'm going to pick up the story in 1809. Sir Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, has just returned to Portugal. He quickly went up to Porto and through the French out of Portugal's second city, and very quickly afterwards out of Portugal itself. What followed then was a mixed success campaign with the Spanish armies that led to the Battle of Talavera. But heavily outnumbered, Wellington rapidly retreated back to the Portuguese border. Whilst he was stationed there, Wellington heard about the Austrian defeat at Wagram in July 1809. Napoleon announced that he would lead a new French invasion in 1810 to throw the British out of the peninsula. Wellington needed somewhere with strong defences to resist the larger French forces. Looking at a map of the Iberian Peninsula, there were two major routes between Portugal and Spain, and if the French were going to invade Portugal, they were likely to use one of these. The first was in the north through Ciudad Rodrigo and Almeida, and the second to the south through Badajoz and Elvas. But Wellington realized that it was impossible for him to hold a 1,200-kilometer border, so he needed somewhere else where he could be safe. Up to the summer of 1810, all these fortresses were in Allied hands, but that was going to change. So Wellington's defensive plan, which he thought would enable him to defeat the French, was to build the lines of Torres Vedras, which is a talk in itself. Wellington, as expected, was not strong enough to stop the French invasion, which now started under Marshal Massena. Napoleon had decided that a new wife and a new heir to the throne was more important than invading Spain. So Massena took the two northern fortresses through the summer of 1810. Wellington briefly slowed the French invasion down at Busaco in October 1810, and then retreated to the lines of Torres Vedras in October 1810, thinking the French would not be able to stay long in front of them. Unfortunately, in that, Wellington was wrong, and it was 5 months before the French retreated. Wellington's plan at this point was to retake the two northern fortresses that he'd lost, but just as he started chasing Massena's French army north, Badajoz was unexpectedly lost to the French under Marshal Soult, and this completely threw his plans into a shambles. Wellington could not really invade Spain whilst he did not control the Portuguese border, because the French potentially could advance on Lisbon when he was moving either north or south in the country. And 1811 ended up being a bit of a stalemate, with squabbles going on essentially around the two fortresses of Ciudad Rodrigo and Badajoz. Albuera was fought to stop the French resupplying Badajoz, and Fuentes de Noro was fought to stop the French resupplying Almeida. But moving on, the plan for 1812, Wellington needed to regain control of the Portuguese border. Almeida in the north had been abandoned by the French in a destroyed state after their defeat at Fuentes de Noro. Wellington needed to capture Badajoz and Ciudad Rodrigo, and Ciudad Rodrigo was the easiest for two reasons. One, it was a weaker fortress than Badajoz, and the second one, and the deciding one probably, was that Wellington believed if he attacked Ciudad Rodrigo, the French forces to the south would not come to reinforce the French forces around Ciudad Rodrigo. Conversely, if Wellington attacked Badajoz, he was reasonably sure that French forces around Spain would come to the support of the French around Badajoz. As I've said, whilst the French held Badajoz, Wellington could not advance into Spain. So let's go back a step now, having set the scene, and talk a little bit about defences. So let's talk about how these developed over time. What you're looking at here is probably a traditional ancient medieval fort. It has a wall, it has a ditch, and not much else. This worked reasonably well until the invention of gunpowder, when the wall could not withstand cannonballs. So then we got some thinkers coming in to redesign the fort. So the first thing we did is add a glacis. This is a sloping wall on the outside, which effectively did two things. It hid the wall, and it meant any cannonballs approaching the wall were deflected away from it. To destroy the wall, you had to destroy the glacis first. Now let's start building on that. The weakest point now is the flat curtain walls. So let's put something in front of them. So can I introduce the ravelin? This is a small standalone defense, which again has to be destroyed before you can get to the main wall behind it. And again, looking up in the top right of the slide, you can see that what we're doing is putting extra complication for the attackers. We have two ditches and essentially three walls that have to be attacked. But we can go on. Let's now protect the bastions on the fort. So we build a hornwork, of course, with another ravelin outside of it. And again, looking at the plan, you can see that we now have 4 walls, 3 ditches, which have to be worked through by the attackers. Each new line of defense pushes the attackers further from the wall and makes breaking the wall of the fortress harder. Here's an example in real life: Fort Grasser, Fort La Lippe at Elvash. This is a small square fort. And if you look in the center, you can see the square fort, pointed bastions on each corner. Outside of the flat walls, there are 4 ravelins. And then at the top of the picture, the most likely route of attack, you have a hornwork and another ravelin. This is quite small, but if you've been there, the walls are incredibly thick. Please also note the circled little watchtower on the left-hand side, beautifully modelled by Captain Andrews of the Royal Engineers. If we now look at this fort from the outside, this is what you can see from the outside. Again, the little watchtower is highlighted. Bear in mind that all these buildings on the top were not there in the early 18th century. So effectively, the attackers can't see what they're firing at. The point of all these slides is that you need big guns if you want to breach a fortress with any form of modern defences built around it. Let's talk a little bit about the guns, very simply, but 3 types were in use. The cannon, these had long range. They were generally accurate, probably more accurate than many of you think. Their role in a siege was to actually breach the walls. Supporting the cannon were howitzers. These are shorter range weapons, not very accurate. They're really for counter battery fire and for anti-personnel fire. They were trying to keep everybody's heads down. And the final type that you'd see mentioned at a siege is a mortar. These were high-angle weapons which are designed to lob big, heavy explosive shells over the wall and cause damage behind. So you'll find in any siege you look at in this period, you should see all these 3 types of weapon represented. So talking again about breaching a wall, cannon, even at this time, were probably more accurate than you think. And they're at sensible distances, 400, 500, 600 meters, they could be hitting a wall within a fairly small area, a matter of a small number of feet. So to bring a wall down effectively, you cut a horizontal line at the base of the wall because you wanted the wall to collapse right to the bottom. So cut that down first. Then you start cutting 2 vertical slots above this. And the intention is at some point, the wall will collapse. You have to do it in this order because if you start blasting away with inaccurate guns or anywhere on the wall, the rubble falls down and stops you attacking the bottom of the wall. So this is what the artillery were trying to do in a siege. So to do this, to cut this accurately, the guns have to be accurate. That effectively means in good condition, which effectively means something approaching new. The bigger the cannon, the bigger the effect. The trade-off is, of course, that the bigger the cannon, the heavier they are. Worn guns are much less accurate. If you can't hit the same spot, you need more ammunition, which has got a bigger transport issue to get it there. If you fire from too far away, you have the same problem, accuracy and more ammunition required. If you try and fire at an angle, the same again. So all of these things sort of build up the huge logistics problem you have. If you start with poor worn guns like they did at Badajoz in 1811, the logistics burden just gets bigger all the time. Right. Ciudad Rodrigo itself is slightly different from what I've talked about here because they add another level of fortification, the full spray, which is effectively a second wall outside of the main wall. Like everything else, its purpose is to deflect attacks on the main wall. And this is a scale drawing that was done by the engineer John Bucoy in January 1812. So this is just before the siege started. showing the intention, which is the cannon hit the glacis or the false spray, and the shot are deflected up away from the town wall. Unfortunately, the French in 1810 and the Allies in 1812 discovered there was a problem with this, which is the false spray was too low. And this is kind of what you ended up with. It was possible to start attacking the wall without having to completely demolish the defenses on the outside of it. Let's dig a little bit deeper into logistics. What does it take to move a gun with a couple of days ammunition? So 24-pounder cannon, roughly 4 metric tons on its carriage. Depending on the weather and the state of the roads, anything up to 16 oxen to pull each of them. To round shot for one gun for 2 days, probably is going to take about 8 carts. Powder for one gun for 2 days, another 4 carts. And of course, all of these beasts and carts need civilians to look after them. And don't forget, also the people and the beasts need feeding. The picture on the right is a Royal Logistics Corps officer when he actually finds something looking like an original ox cart from this time. But don't get Mike started on iron axle trees or you'll be there for a very long time. So summary, 124-pounder, 2 days. We have 40 oxen, we have 16 carts, we have 15 men approximately. Not too bad. Now let's start scaling this up to the sort of things that could be happening at this time. What does it look like if we go to 40 24-pounder cannon? We now have 1,600 oxen, 500 carts, 600 civilians, and you're shifting about 300 metric tons of equipment. You can see as you start building substantial siege trains, the challenge of moving these around, feeding them, probably trying to get across rivers in poor condition on poor quality roads gets more and more difficult. So go back to a picture of the Iberian Peninsula. This is built around quite significant mountain ranges and very significant rivers. And these very much dictated where you could travel and how you could travel between places. Roads in the Iberian Peninsula were essentially unpaved. The main royal roads, the postal routes, were paved. Most else wasn't. In rocky areas, they were steep, they were rocky, hairpin bends, could be horrendously rutted. In winter, everything just got worse. And the 2 quotes below, I think, sum up the unpaved and the paved fairly well. If it's not paved, you get huge, deep ruts, which when it's muddy and wet, become impassable. If they do pave them, and this is talking about roads in Portugal particularly, they do it by throwing large round stones, which invariably are calculated to destroy horses and carriages fast. The picture on the right is from Portugal, and this would be classed as a good paved road. But I can imagine anybody who rides a horse will be looking at this and thinking, would you want to risk your horse's legs on such an uneven and hard surface? The rivers, you can't get across a lot of them without some form of bridging. So the Tagus at Lisbon is 0.5 kilometre or more wide. You go inland and it gets narrower, but then it gets steeper. The Douro is similar. It's very wide at Porto, but as you go inland, in some places is utterly impassable. And then you get the smaller ones, but still not insignificant. The Coa River Almeida, you can't get across without a bridge. The Rabago is a more extreme version up in the north of Portugal. It might look small, but Soult used that as the only way across this river with his army when he was retreating from Porto in 1809. I'm going to very quickly go through this slide just to kind of set the scene of what I'm going to talk about after, but this isn't, don't try and remember it, and it's not relevant other than scene setting. So the important point about this is to look at the overall time scale. The order to move the siege train was given in May 1811. 2 months later, the order was given for the siege train to be moved from Porto up the River Douro. A month later, we're starting seeing some of the guns arriving halfway to Ciudad Rodrigo. And it's another month before the ammunition we've already talked about was there. So we're now already 4 months into this progress. Nothing then really happened for 2 months. Wellington was looking for an opportunity, and there were other reasons which I'll come back to why nothing was moved forward to Almeida for a while. End of November, the guns were at Almeida, the ammunition wasn't. Middle of December, we're starting preparing all the siege material that was needed for the troops to dig their trenches. And the decision to move forward wasn't till the very last days of December. And it was another 2 weeks before the guns opened. And then the fortress was taken really quickly. But from the 14th of May to 19th of January is the time taken to get a siege train across the country to Ciudad Rodrigo. Recap on what we're talking about. The siege train started at Lisbon, and it took effectively 8 months to get to Ciudad Rodrigo. This was Wellington's planning at its best, but there were issues, as I've already said. So these are Wellington's orders from July 1811. This is the siege train he put together. 68 guns, 38 were cannon, and the other 30 were howitzers and mortars. I'd just like you to note the bottom line on this table. You are moving close to 500 tons of equipment already on poor roads, on very crude ox carts with a carrying capacity of about 1/4 of a ton if you're lucky. Putting the same thing a different way, how many carts and oxen did Wellington believe he needed at this point? The number is 1,100 carts, 3,000 oxen. And please note, the oxen required to move the guns were about 1/4 of the number, and none of the carts were involved. So again, remember from this, most of the movement of equipment for a siege wasn't the guns, it was all the equipment, material, ammunition that were required to let the guns function. So let's drill down a little bit into the route. Having shipped the siege train from Lisbon to Porto up the Atlantic Ocean, the plan was to move it up the River Douro to Peço de Ragua, and then overland Lamego, Transcoso, and then onward to Ciudad Rodrigo. So a mixture of river and land transport. So you think moving up the Douro River, we've seen some big pictures of it. It's a big river, but it had rapids, it had shallows, it was fast flowing most of the time, particularly in the winter. 200 local boats were requisitioned. And by boat, we mean something of the size of the picture in the bottom. These were port barges, not small boats. Give you an idea of the size and carrying capacity, the bigger port barges in terms of carrying capacity will be something like a petrol tanker that you see on the roads in the UK. But of course, nothing was ever that simple. About halfway between Porto and Peço de Ragua was rapids at Vimiero. The big boats, fully loaded, couldn't get up them. The little boats, they didn't have enough to carry the cargo. So the compromise, as always, is the big boats went up half loaded until they were above the rapids at Vimiero, and then all the equipment was unloaded by hand from the small to the big to continue upriver. This required multiple trips of some of the boats that had been assigned to do this. So the route we've already talked about from Porto to Ciudad Rodrigo, the officer in overall command of getting the siege train there was Alexander Dixon, and he actually moved to Porto, coming through Almeida, and then followed the route. And in doing this, he found that the route around Transcoso was actually impassable for artillery. He also noted that the bridge over the River Coa near Almeida was broken and also needed to be repaired. And Dixon recommended a change of route with the siege train going from Via de Pont to Pinhel and down to Almeida. but orders were issued for both of these routes to be repaired, just to leave some options open. Okay, so we're all organised now, except we're not. All the siege gun equipment that had been brought up to Porto was designed to be pulled by horses. Horses use harnesses to pull heavy loads. Oxen, on the other hand, use yokes. Horses were not available, and the cannon, as we've already said, are going to be pulled by the oxen. The open-sided carts were not very good for carrying round shot because they tended to fall off. So several hundred boxes had to be made to carry the round shot. They managed to get together about 900 carts, not the 1100 Wellington had hoped for, but still quite good to get this number together in one place. But it still required 2 trips from the river to Lamego and then 2 further trips down to Via de Pont. There were problems because there weren't enough gun carriages, there were no carriages for the mortars, so Dixon was having to cobble things together to get some of the smaller guns transported to where they needed to be. And bearing in mind that the large numbers that Wellington ordered for the siege train, look at what actually was used in the end. End of September 1811, 1,900 carts, 5,000 oxen, 2,500 civilians, excluding any military personnel, were around Via de Pont. The obvious, of course, that comes around from that is there's absolutely not enough forage for the animals or, frankly, the civilians, and they were dispersed widely. They could have been 40, 60, 80, 100 kilometers away. Wellington had also ordered the ammunition increased to 800 shot per cannon and 400 shells for the howitzers. So this added another 200 tons, 500 metric tons in total to the equipment that had to be moved. And at this point, the ship carrying the powder that Wellington wanted had gone absent without leave, and there was no powder at this point. Before the sea train could move on from Via de Pont, Almeida had to be prepared to receive them. One of the stories that was put about to hopefully try and confuse the French is that the siege guns were to replace the ones damaged at Almeida, but I don't think the French believe that either. Unfortunately for Wellington, the French had fairly thoroughly destroyed it when they abandoned it in May 1811, and the siege train couldn't be risked putting there until some repairs had been made. It was given such an importance that Portuguese militia and soldiers from British line regiments were assigned to progress the repairs. Dixon, as well as trying to organise the movement of the siege train and all the associated equipment, was also tasked with repairing the 90 guns in the Almeida garrison, most of which had been spiked and most of the carriages had been destroyed. So we've talked a lot about the round shot and the shells for the guns. There was great concern that not enough would be easily available, and Dixon had been asked to hunt around the Almeida and look at the trenches and see if they could recover previously used round shot. Eventually about 8,000 were recovered, and that was very useful when it came to the siege. Although it should also be borne in mind that a lot of this round shot recovery was not in particularly good condition, and that affects the accuracy of the guns. Also, a significant number of the round shot that were recovered were Spanish 16 pounder round shot, which would fit a British 18 pounder, but again they didn't fit very well, so it affected both accuracy and power. So the siege train waited at Via de Pont until all this work had been done. The order was issued on the 14th of November to move the siege train forward. By this point, of course, the siege train had been sitting at Via de Pont for 2 months, and I've already commented on the problem with supplying forage for all the various animals. So when this order was given, it took some significant time before sufficient number of carts and oxen could be recalled to the locations. There was only about 200 carts present at Via de Pont when the order was given, and that was nothing like enough to move the huge amount of ammunition that was resting there. And this is one of a number of examples where the flaws in the civilian transport system came about. All the carts, almost all the civilians, all the oxen were privately owned and effectively rented by the army. Unfortunately, through most of the Peninsular War, the British government was a bit lax at paying for these services, and even worse, providing food for the oxen and the owners of the carts and the oxen, which throughout the war led to widespread desertion. And this was certainly the case here, that even the carts they had present at the start started disappearing very quickly when they started moving all the equipment forward, particularly as the weather was getting worse. And we're now at 14th of November, and there still was very little powder with the siege train. Most of it was still up near the River Douro at Lamego. The next problem is, of course, crossing the River Agueda. This runs close by the foot of Ciudad Rodrigo, between Almeida and Ciudad Rodrigo. To carry out the siege, the Allied army need to be across the river, and the only bridge in the area was the bridge at Ciudad Rodrigo, which clearly could not be used by the Allies. So before the siege could start, we need a way of getting across the Agueda. This task was given to Lieutenant Colonel Henry Sturgeon from the Royal Staff Corps, who built himself a reputation for coming up with novel bridging solutions. And the bridging at Almaraz, Alcantara, and at the Adura in 1814 were all based on designs originally from his brain. The bridge even here was not insignificant. The river about 100, well, probably 100 meters wide, and the bridge had to be slightly longer. It was made up of 22 trestles. Made of wood, big box at the bottom, filled with stones to give them some stability. Anchors upriver to help them with the current, because the weather was getting worse, the rivers were getting higher. And even these trestles weren't insignificant, because the plan was that the roadway would be 12 feet above the level of the river. So these were quite substantial things that were being built at Almeida with the intention of moving to the river when the siege was announced. You'd think we're finished at this point, but no, we're not. The other thing that's missing from all the equipment and materials that's been put together is the incidental consumable siege material, the fascines, the gabions to build the trenches and protect them. The order was given on the 17th of December to prepare the siege materials, and the numbers are quite significant. Fascines, 6 foot long, 1 foot thick, 2,500, gabions, 2,000. You add all this up, you're talking again about another 200 metric tons of equipment, so roughly 800 carts to move all of the stuff. And some of this material was being prepared up to 40 kilometers away from Ciudad Rodrigo. So the transport requirement was not insignificant. So finally, the order comes on the 28th of December 1811 to move the siege train forward. The original plan was to commence the siege on the 6th of January 1812. I should expect the only other thing that could be thrown at the problems they had was the weather. So early January, heavy snowfalls, howling gales, awful weather, and they literally could not move the carts to Ciudad Rodrigo. The start of the siege was delayed by 2 days, just to give a bit more time for some of the equipment to get through. As mentioned previously, and again, When the order to move the guns forward was given on the 28th of December, there was not enough transport available, and quite a number of these disappeared very quickly when the civilian owners looked at the weather and what they were being expected to do. The problems with transport had already made a difficult decision for Wellington, that they would not use any howitzers or mortars in the siege, essentially because there was no ammunition for them that was going to be available. The Trestle Bridge commenced building on the 1st of January. The oxen to move the guns did not appear until the second week in January, by which time Wellington must have get particularly concerned. And the day for the opening of the siege guns is probably more related to the arrival of the oxen to move the guns than particularly everything was ready for the siege to begin. So this again, just a summary. The siege train was 68 guns, but 30 of them were not being used at the siege. Wellington justified this decision in his dispatch after the successful taking of Ciudad Rodrigo, saying, "We proceeded at Ciudad Rodrigo on quite a new principle of sieges. The whole object of our fire was to lay open the walls." This may sound good, but the downside of that was that there was less damage to the defenders, which meant there was more defensive equipment available when the assault was made. And it also means throughout the siege, the defenders were able to fire on the attackers without anybody firing back. So it was one solution, but it was a solution that certainly will have ended up with more Allied casualties. Wellington was still making this claim about a new way of doing sieges in 1813. I don't believe it was any more believable then than it was when he first said it in January 1812. So, summary, Siege of Ciudad Rodrigo. As I said, I'm not going to talk about it now. It's the lead up, just trying to understand how difficult this has been. It was a snap decision. Wellington received captured dispatches showing that the defenders in the area the French defenders in the area had been ordered to send some troops to the east coast of Spain, and Wellington saw an opportunity as the defenders in front of him were reduced in size. The transport issues and the weather issues meant there were no howitzers or mortars, and as I've already said, I believe this led to more casualties. This was the most successful siege in the war. It was a matter of days from opening fire before the town was eventually stormed. Overall, there was excellent planning for the siege, 8 months of planning to get the equipment here. But even then, as we said, there were some issues. The decision not to use the howitzers was not the original plan, and I think this was Wellington trying to make light of the situation. There were mistakes made in the siege, but again, that's a talk for another day. And even with this brand new siege train and everything going pretty well, there were still 2,000 Allied troops killed and wounded during the siege. So the next task, and bearing in mind, this is one that Wellington knew was coming. We now need to go further back south, having now got control of the two fortresses in the north. We now need to go south and retake the last one remaining in French possession. 200 kilometers to the south, there are few roads going north to south in central Spain. And the decision that Wellington, with his engineer and artillery commanders, came to soon after the successful taking of Ciudad Rodrigo is that the big siege guns could not be moved south because there was no transport and there was no adequate roads. So Badajoz again was another cobbled together siege using some new guns they had in Lisbon and then borrowing older worn guns. There was no Allied siege during the Peninsular War that had enough guns, and when I say enough, I mean more than they could use, until the second siege of San Sebastian, which was August 1813. So, fortunately, ladies and gents, I'm pretty much finished now. Summarizing it, when you talk about sieges, you need to understand the massive logistical exercise that needs to be put together to deliver many hundreds of tons of equipment across poor roads and across wide and difficult rivers. Most of Wellington's sieges, there was rarely time to plan properly. The roads were poor, transport resources were scarce because they were hired in, and the British Army generally didn't pay them. Siege equipment was scarce. Wellington did get some new siege trains later on in the war, but certainly in 1811 was borrowing anything he could find from Portuguese and Spanish fortresses. Many compromises were made, and I believe this led to increased casualties in the army. Just before I wind up and say thank you and take questions, I would like to do a plug, but also point you at one of my books, Wellington's Favourite Engineer. This is about John Burgoyne, the first Field Marshal in the Royal Engineers, but it does have a detailed section on the siege of Ciudad Rodrigo. It uses a lot of primary material from the Royal Engineers archives, which hasn't been used before, and talks in detail about some of the issues and problems they had during the most successful siege the Allied armies had. Please feel free to buy it. It would make me very happy. If you just want to know a bit more generally about the sieges during the war, Wellington Engineers talks about the whole Peninsular campaign. And at this point, thank you very much for listening, ladies and gentlemen, and I'd be happy to take any questions you have. Okay, I think at this point I'm waiting for Dudley to join me again. Yes, I am.
You are. Sorry, I had a problem with my camera, Mark. I do apologise. Ladies and gentlemen, I have put up a link on to Mark's webpage, which you can just click on, and it will download into a separate window in your browser. Can I just say, first of all, I mean, there's been a number of comments in the chat box, Mark, about how stunningly good this talk was. I just found it absolutely fascinating. And unsurprisingly, there's a lot of questions that have come in. And you've done very well because you've kept to time very well. But I'm going to allow about half an hour or so for questions. I'm only saying that, Mark, just in case you go on a bit too long with your answers, because the problem with logistics is there's just so much detail. So anyway, let me go through the questions as they've come in. So the first question comes from Andrew, and logistically, were the guns shipped to the peninsula from the UK, or were they manufactured in Portugal?
Most of the ones used by, I'm going to use the word Allied Army, but let's say the British Army, came from Britain. They were provided by the Board of Ordnance. That's not to say the Spanish and the Portuguese didn't have their own arsenals and didn't produce their own guns, but unhelpfully, they were all slightly different sizes. So even if you had a similar size, like a French or a Portuguese or a Russian or a Spanish 24-pounder, the actual bores would be slightly different. So the round shot would either jam or rattle. So the answer to the question is mainly from Britain, but if they were desperate, they'd take whatever they could get hold of.
Thank you. Marcus has asked this question: the good planning and logistics which led to the success at Rodrigo in 1812 seem to have been ignored 3 months later at Badajoz. Or did Wellington just decide that he had no choice but to proceed without all the necessary equipment? And I know you covered part of that in your talk.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I have a view, which I will say now, but I don't frankly know what Wellington was playing at. He knew he had to take Ciudad Rodrigo. He knew he had to take Badajoz, preferably both in 1812. Badajoz was a harder fortress to take. It was much more substantial. But the planning on moving a siege train to Badajoz didn't seem to start until the end of January 1812, when Wellington sat down with his engineer and artillery commanders and said, right, guys, how can we get the siege train to Badajoz? And the answer was, you can't. At which point they were then scrabbling around with a small number, I think about a dozen new 24-pounders in a ship in Lisbon Harbour. They then said, oh, the Royal Navy will give us some. Sorry, we don't have any 24-pounders on our boats in the Tagus, but I can give you some 18-pounders. Oh, okay, that'll do nicely. Those 18-pounders you gave us, they're Russian and in very poor condition. Well, yeah, but that's all we've got. So you look at what happened from the end of January through to sort of March, and it didn't seem to be planned, and I just do not get that. He knew he was going to have to do it. He could have ordered out another siege train that was ready to use, but he didn't. And I've seen nothing to explain that.
Ewan's asked, Mark, can you tell us anything about attempts to patch running repairs on the fortifications while still under siege?
Yeah, the French were very good at it. Unfortunately for the Allied army, apart from at Ciudad Rodrigo, where the governor Barrier was a late addition when the previous governor got captured, and Barrier is fairly roundly condemned for his lack of activity. But if you look at the siege of Badajoz in 1812 and even the ones in 1811, Burgos late 1812, San Sebastian 1813, the French were very good at clearing away debris in the breaches to make them more difficult to get into, putting obstacles in the breaches and making sure there were guns that could fire on any attackers. So yeah, the French were very good. You tried to do it at night when nobody was firing, and there was certainly a number of complaints, Burgos particularly, where the French made huge improvements in the breaches overnight when the artillery officers were supposed to be firing, and some were threatened with court-martial if they didn't get their act together. So the French were very good at it and made life much harder for the attackers.
Thank you. Marcus has asked a second question. Wellington only took 3 18-pounders and 5 howitzers to the siege of Burgos in 1812. The siege was a disaster. How could he?
How long you got?
How could he have expected it to succeed?
Yeah, I think fair comment. If anybody wants to know sort of detail, again, I'd refer you to Wellington's favourite engineer, because John Burgoyne was the chief engineer at that siege. But trying to answer the question, I don't believe when he set off for the 1812 campaign that he was expecting to carry out a siege. Marcus is absolutely right in that 3 18-pounders and 5 howitzers. This was basically just field guns attached to the army that they were dragging along. 18-pounders were slightly unusual, as were the 24-pounder howitzers that were going with it. But the original idea was just a really, really heavy battery for the field army. He used the same guns at Salamanca to take down the fort, the temporary fortresses that the French had built. And frankly, that was pretty much a disaster as well. So when he dragged them onto Burgos and made no attempt to add extra guns, it was a complete disaster. And a bit like I said about Badajoz in 1812, he didn't seem to prepare for it. And when he realized it was going to be harder than he thought, he didn't call for any guns to come forward until far too late. So I don't think it was poor logistics. I think it was poor planning. Don't blame the guys with the carts on the oxen because nobody asked them to be there.
I like that answer. Beth has asked, were the winter conditions the reason the fighting was suspended at that time of the year?
Generally, yes. There was a fighting season, and really from about October through to March, nothing happened. 1812 was funny in that it started early in January 1812 with the siege of Ciudad Rodrigo. But I think, again, that was opportunist on Wellington's part when he found out the French were withdrawing troops from the area. I don't think he planned to move forward for some weeks, and that possibly explains why all the siege materials weren't up there. The 1812 campaign also overran at the other end with the siege of Burgos going into October and the retreat from Burgos going into November. So the Allied army was twice moving in appalling wintry conditions in 1812, and it didn't really help the soldiers to build any enthusiasm for siege work.
Vic has asked, were the parallels on the Little Tesson dug fresh, or did they use the French parallels from the previous siege in 1810?
Good question, Vic. Don't know would be the short answer. From memory, well, I would guess not, because they didn't really do that much on the Little Tesson. That's the forward of the two hills that both the French and the Allied army attacked from. So I'm speculating. I'm going to say no more, because the honest answer is don't know.
I always like an answer like that. If you don't know, you don't know. Andrews asked, was a network of supply depots established to feed ordnance forward to the siege train?
Sort of, yes, in that, as I've kind of said during the talk, things were moving forward very, very late from Porto, from the River Douro, and down towards Ciudad Rodrigo. So there was a steady train of stuff moving forward. In terms of the siege itself, they tried to keep about 2 days worth of ammunition at the siege itself, and then the rest was being shipped in from Gallegos, which was about 10-15 kilometers to the west of Ciudad Rodrigo and on the opposite side of the Agueda River. So not so much supply depots, as most of it was at Gallegos or at Almeida, and they just brought it forward just in time.
Roberts asked a question which starts with, let's talk about the carts. You said there were 1,900 eventually in use. How many were taken from those already in use by the commissary? Considering there were probably 30,000 troops in the facility in late 1811, how did this impact the feeding of the troops?
Hi, Bob. Thanks for the question. Love difficult questions. There were 1,900 eventually at Villa de Pont in the end of September. A lot of them were from the commissary. So there was a lot of begging, borrowing, stealing carts through this period. And that's why a lot of them disappeared very quickly, because the commissary needed them back to move food to the troops. Certainly, as you got closer to Ciudad Rodrigo and the siege itself, they were nicking mules from the divisions to carry ammunition forward. So they were taking all the ammunition mules for the divisions and putting sacks across their backs, and then using them to carry half a dozen 24-pounder shot up. So it was a real, shall we say, ad hoc arrangement that was going on to how would we put it, to have the least worst consequence of not having the right number of carts and mules and oxen in the right place. And that's why a lot of the ammunition particularly didn't get forward. There just weren't carts to do it, and you can't starve the army to bring a siege train forward.
I like that answer again. Armies never change. There's so much pilfering that goes on. Quartermasters in the rearward areas looking after their own. Rohan has asked the question, how did the British siege train compare with the French?
Okay, an interesting question. In a lot of ways, I would generalize to say there wasn't a lot of difference. If they both had relatively modern equipment, they were relatively equal in terms of their size and scale for the big events during the war. They were different calibers, which made them slightly different. But I think the biggest difference in the peninsula between the French and the Allied sieges is not so much the siege trains themselves. It's the amount of time that the different armies had to carry out the sieges. Wellington carried out almost all of his against time. He was looking over his shoulder, waiting for a French army to arrive. The French invariably never had that problem, and most of the fortresses they took during the Peninsular War surrendered. I'm struggling to think of one off the top of my head without going to the really small ones where it was actually assaulted. But the French also made it very clear that if you make us assault, it's not going to be pretty. With hindsight, of course, you can say you could put the same criticism on the British Army when they assaulted fortresses during this time. Wellington certainly had problems in 1811 as he didn't have a siege train to hand. That's not to say he didn't have one, but if you look at the timescales for getting the siege train to Ciudad Rodrigo, we talked about 8 months. When Wellington unexpectedly lost Badajoz in March 1811, and so many books say, well, why didn't he just bring forward a siege train from Lisbon? The answer was because it would probably have taken 3 to 4 months. Wellington was looking to take the fortress back in a matter of weeks. So he was borrowing guns from the nearest fortresses, some of which were a couple of 100 years old. Bit of a long answer to the question. So going back to specifically the question, I think they generally both had broadly similar equipment if they had time to bring it in for a siege.
We've got two remaining questions. If there's still time, if anyone wants to write another question in the chat box. But Robert's asked, you mentioned gabions. I think you said 1,000. What were they made of and how? Considering that the area had been supporting tens of thousands of troops for the previous 4 years, all of them would have needed firewood. Where did they get it from? And how many gabions would fit on one cart? Yeah,
thanks, Bob, for going for the challenge for how many questions can you fit into a question. Right, okay, let's start at the top. What were they made of? Generally, they were made of, just gross generalization again, but willow, some soft, pliable, flexible branches that you could mold into a shape. A gabion is effectively a circular container without a bottom. You pulled it into place by a trench, and then you quickly filled it with soil, and it gave you some cover from the defender's fire. They could be made out of any flexible wood, and there are wonderful tables in some of the engineered journals telling you about the weight of gabions if they're made of oak or elm or birch or anything else that was local. Point about tens of thousands of troops in the area taking firewood. Yes, it's valid. It might be part of the reason why some of this material was being prepared quite a long way away. Burgoyne complained that some of this material was being made 40 kilometers away from Ciudad Rodrigo. That might have had something to do with it. How many gabions would fit on a cart? Well, in terms of weight, they probably weigh, 30 kilos, something like that. So in theory, you might get 20 on, but physically, there's no way you'd fit them on. My guess would be you might get about 10 on and maybe a few more if you could strap them on the top, because they were fairly big and fairly bulky. 600 60 centimeters up to about 1 meter in diameter. So they're not easy things to move about. I think that's gone through all Bob's points.
It is, and I'm mightily impressed by your quick calculations off the hoof. Last question, therefore, comes from Fred. You don't mention sappers. Were the conditions totally unsuitable for their use?
I wonder if Fred's a sapper. He can maybe answer that one while I'm answering. There were, where are we talking about? 1812. Okay. The experience of the sieges in 1811 at Badajoz, where there were effectively no sappers available, you could probably count on one hand the number who were there. The experience of that led Wellington to ask for volunteers from the divisions to be trained in sapping through the end of 1811, so he would have some troops he could use in the sieges he expected in 1812. I'm going to backtrack at this point and say, why were there no sappers? At this point, the School of Military Engineering hadn't been established. It wasn't established until April 1812. So at this point, although there were 2,500 royal sappers and miners, no, royal military artificers in existence, they were basically trained for depot work. None of them were trained for operating in the field. So they weren't taught about trenching or batteries or anything like that. There were joiners, plumbers, wheelwrights, etc., etc. So the number in the peninsula of royal military artificers in total at this point was probably less than 100, most of whom were, frankly, completely untrained for this job. So there were temporary sappers, like there were assistant engineers, who were people from the line regiments who were given some quick training. So there was somebody available for the engineer officers, who were the only people in the Royal Engineers at that time, officers only, to order about. So a bit of a long-winded answer to the question. Sappers as we know them today didn't exist in January 1812.
It's actually prompted a further question, so I'll put it up from Neil. What was Wellington's view of his engineer officer corps at this time? Was he critical of their siege expertise, or did he simply need more of them?
Wellington was renowned for not being happy with the contribution of most units and organizations. So we can start with the British government, Spanish government, Portuguese government, Royal Navy, you name it, he didn't like it. And the engineers were no different. He generally had a good relationship with the senior engineer officers around him. It was Richard Fletcher for most of the war. But after Badajoz in 1811, he certainly wrote home after Ciudad Rodrigo in 1812, moaning about the lack of sappers and how they were really, really needed. He had made some comment in late 1811 about, if I do another siege, I'm going to be my own engineer, which the engineers took some umbrage at. And after Badajoz, he wrote a fairly scathing private letter home, basically trying to paraphrase a long letter. It said something along the lines of, the engineers don't really care that much. As long as they can blow a hole in the wall somewhere, they don't really care after that. And it's up to the line infantry to sort of dig us out the mire and make this thing work. That unfortunately, even private letters eventually come into the public domain, and it didn't go down desperately well. He certainly needed more of them, but without the sappers and miners to support them, more engineer officers might not have helped all that much.
The last thing, it's not a question, but I really do want to put it up because I think it speaks for everyone in the audience. Sorry, let me put it up. It's from Vic, who says, thank you, Mark, for an extremely well presented and researched presentation. And from Paul, who says, an impressive presentation with even more impressive answers to the questions. And actually, if you can open up your chat box, you'll see lots of comments like that, Mark, this evening. I think it's gone down extremely well. And yes, please put some applause into the chat box.
Well, thank you everybody for listening. The intention of tonight was really, just as always, to make you think about the wider aspects of the battles and the sieges. And it's easy to criticize how well Wellington did or didn't do in sieges, but it was tricky. He quite often didn't help himself, but this was not an easy exercise in a foreign country with limited transport opportunities.
Yeah, okay. I said to Mark before we started that hackneyed phrase that I hate most in the world is when a general comes up with that trite phrase, which is amateurs talk tactics and professionals talk logistics. It normally means I can't be bothered by this, but I want to sound interested in logistics. You need to be interested in logistics. And I thought that was just a marvelous and fascinating talk this evening. So Mark, once again, on behalf of the audience, I'd like to thank you for speaking to us this evening. I know that next month's speaker is in the audience, Ewan Carmichael. And when you leave this talk this evening, I will there's a link there for registering for next month. Ewan, you've got a very hard act to follow. Anyway, thank you very much, everybody, for attending this evening. Hopefully, I'll see some of you next month in August, when we'll be talking about the Battle of Minden with Ewan Carmichael, the chair of the society. Good night, everybody.
Okay, good night. Thank you very much.